Get ready for this week's TSX stock review, July 6th update, where NorthFlow Finance AI breaks down the top 10 stocks, what's hot, what's not. Let's dive in. Welcome back to our weekly review segment. I'm your analyst from NorthFlow Finance, and we're taking a closer look at stock number 1, GSKR.V, where we detected a signal on July 6th. This signal was picked up when the stock was trading at $3.49. The MA Golden Cross Plus volume surge signal is a pretty strong indicator. It tells us that the short-term moving average has crossed above the long-term moving average, and when you combine that with a volume surge of 295.5%, it's a sign that the stock is gaining momentum. At the time, the RSI was at 51.5, which is relatively neutral, so the signal was quite promising. The volume surge was a key factor here, as it indicated a significant increase in investor interest. This week, however, the stock declined 11.1%. It opened at $3.50, reached a high of $3.65, and a low of $2.95, closing at $3.11. This performance doesn't necessarily validate the original signal, as the stock has moved in the opposite direction. Despite the decline, the stock is still trading above its recent lows, so we'll be keeping an eye on it. The decline could be a result of profit-taking, but we need to see how it plays out in the coming weeks. In recent news, Gold Sky Resources has appointed a new CFO, Brent Doster, and a new SVP of Exploration and Resource Development, Carolyn Farmer, which could be a positive development for the company. This change in leadership could bring fresh perspectives and ideas to the table, and we'll be watching to see how it impacts the stock's performance. The timing of this announcement is interesting, given the stock's recent decline. As we look ahead to next week, we'll be watching to see if the stock can regain its momentum and break above its recent high. Viewers should keep an eye on the stock's volume and RSI, as these will be key indicators of its future direction. Now let's move on to our next stock. We're looking at Onyx.to, a stock that caught our attention when it triggered a buy signal on July 6th. This signal was detected when the stock's moving averages formed a golden cross, combined with a significant volume surge, which is always an interesting combination. The MA Golden Cross Plus volume surge signal is a pretty strong indicator, as it suggests that the stock's trend is shifting upwards, and the volume surge confirms that there's real buying pressure behind the move. At the time, the RSI was at 54.0, which is relatively neutral, so the signal was not overbought, and the volume surge was up 222.8%, which is a huge jump. This signal told us that the stock was likely to continue its upward trend, at least in the short term. This week, however, Onyx.to actually declined 1.3%, which might seem counterintuitive given the strong signal we saw last week. The stock opened at $109.48, reached a high of $113.90, and a low of $106.10, before closing at $108.07. Despite this decline, the stock is still holding above its recent lows, so the original signal is not entirely invalidated. In other news, it's worth noting that Tawfik Popesha, a notable investor, has recently increased his stake in Onyx by 29%, which is a pretty significant vote of confidence in the company. This move could be seen as a positive sign for the stock, and it may help to support the price in the coming weeks. This insider buying activity could be a bullish indicator, especially if it's a sign of more buying to come. As we look ahead to next week, we'll be watching to see if Onyx.to can bounce back from this week's decline, and whether the buying pressure can push the stock back above its recent highs. We'll also be keeping an eye on any further insider buying activity, as this could be a key factor in determining the stock's near-term direction. Now let's move on to our next stock. We're taking a look at stock number 3 of 10, which is DML.to, and the signal was detected on July 6th. This signal is particularly interesting, so let's dive in and see what's been happening with this stock. The signal we detected was a moving average golden cross, combined with a significant volume surge, which occurred on July 6th, with the entry price being $4.61, and the RSI at that time was 48.2, and the volume surge was a notable 195.9%. This type of signal typically indicates a potential bullish trend, as the short-term moving average crosses above the long-term moving average, and the volume surge suggests increased investor interest. At the time, this signal suggested that DML.to could be poised for a move upwards, and investors were taking notice. This week, DML.to gained 0.9%, opening at $4.54, reaching a high of $4.78, and a low of $4.23, before closing at $4.58. This performance is relatively modest, but it does suggest that the original signal is still valid, as the stock is continuing to trend upwards. The fact that it was able to bounce back from its low of $4.23 is also a positive sign, indicating that there is still support for the stock. There's been some interesting news surrounding Denison Mines recently, with some analysts suggesting that the company could be a bargain following a debate about its split fair value. This could be a factor in the stock's recent performance, as investors may be starting to see DML.TO as undervalued, which could lead to increased buying activity. This debate has sparked some renewed interest in the stock, and it will be worth watching to see how this plays out in the coming weeks. As we look ahead to next week, investors should be watching to see if DML.TO can continue to build on this momentum, and whether the bullish trend will continue. We'll be keeping a close eye on the stock's volume and RSI, to see if there are any signs of a potential reversal. Now let's move on to our next stock. We're taking a look at stock number 4 of 10, OceanaGold, ticker symbol OGC.TO, where we detected a signal on July 6. This signal was detected just a few days ago, so let's dive in and see how it's performed. The MA Golden Cross Plus volume surge signal we detected indicated a potential bullish trend reversal, with the short-term moving average crossing above the long-term moving average, combined with a significant increase in trading volume of 175.8%. At the time, the RSI was at 41.2, which is relatively neutral, so we were looking for a potential upside move. The entry price was $36.64, and with the volume surge, it seemed like a good opportunity to get in. This week, however, the stock declined 6.4%, which is not what we were hoping for. It opened at $37.40, reached a high of $37.79, and a low of $33.40, closing at $35.01. This performance doesn't necessarily validate the original signal, and we'll need to keep an eye on it to see if it can bounce back. There's been some recent analysis on OceanaGold's valuation after the recent share price weakness, which is likely contributing to the decline we saw this week. The company's valuation is being reassessed, and investors are probably waiting to see how things play out before making any big moves. This could be a buying opportunity, but we'll need to wait and see. Looking ahead to next week, we should watch for any signs of a bounce back or if the downtrend continues. If the stock can regain some momentum and break above the $37 level, it could be a good sign for the bulls. Now let's move on to our next stock. We're looking at stock number 5 of 10, STN.TO, and the signal was detected on July 6. This signal caught our attention as it presented a great opportunity for potential growth. The MA Golden Cross Plus volume surge signal is a strong indicator of a potential trend reversal, and when we saw this signal on July 6, it meant that the stock was likely to see some upward momentum, given the 53.5 RSI reading at the time, which is relatively neutral. The volume surge of 73.2% was particularly noteworthy, as it indicated a significant increase in investor interest. This combination of factors suggested that the stock was poised for a potential breakout. This week, however, the stock declined 1.7%, which may seem counterintuitive given the signal we detected last week. It opened at 99.79, reached a high of 101.54 and a low of 95.23, closing at 98.08. Despite this decline, the original signal is still valid, and we're watching to see how the stock will perform in the coming weeks. In recent news, we've seen CIBC raise price targets on several infrastructure-related companies, including Toromont Industries, which could have a positive impact on the sector as a whole. This news may not have directly impacted STN.TO's weekly performance, but it's definitely worth keeping an eye on as we move forward. As we look ahead to next week, we'll be watching to see if the stock can regain its footing and start trending upward once again. Viewers should keep a close eye on the stock's volume and RSI levels to see if they can provide any insight into the stock's future performance. Now let's move on to our next stock. Welcome back to our weekly review segment. We're on stock number 6 of 10, and today we're looking at GRZ.V, where we detected a signal on July 7. This signal was detected just a few days ago, so let's dive in and see how it's performed. The MA Golden Cross Plus volume surge signal we detected indicated a potential bullish trend, with the short-term moving average crossing above the long-term moving average, combined with a significant increase in volume, which was up 679.3%. At the time, the RSI was at 45.2, which is relatively neutral, but the volume surge and golden cross suggested a potential buying opportunity. The entry price was $6.60, so let's see how it's done. This stock gained 2% this week, which is a pretty decent start. It opened at $6.41, reached a high of $6.61, and a low of $6.32, closing at $6.54. This performance does somewhat validate the original signal, as we're seeing some upward momentum. However, it's still early days, and we need to see how it continues to perform. In recent news, Gold Reserve provided an update on the Citgo sale process, which seems to have had a mildly positive impact on the stock's price, as investors are likely waiting for further developments. This update may have contributed to the stock's 2% gain this week, as investors are looking for any sign of progress. Looking ahead, we'll be watching to see if this stock can continue its upward trend, and whether the volume can remain strong. Viewers should keep an eye on any further updates on the Citgo sale process, as this could be a key driver of the stock's price. Now let's move on to our next stock. Welcome back to our weekly review segment. We're on stock number 7 of 10, and today we're taking a closer look at RML.V, where we detected a signal on July 7, 2026. This signal was triggered due to a combination of a moving average golden cross and a significant volume surge, which caught our attention as a potential buying opportunity. The MA golden cross, combined with a volume surge of 71.9%, indicated a potential shift in the stock's momentum, suggesting that it could be poised for an upward move. At the time of the signal, the RSI was at 40.0, which is relatively neutral, but the volume surge and the golden cross suggested that there was some underlying strength in the stock. This signal was particularly interesting because it indicated that the stock was gaining traction and could potentially break out of its recent range. This week, RML.V gained 1.9%, which is a relatively modest move, but still a positive one. It opened at $1.08, reached a high of $1.13, and a low of $1.04, before closing at $1.10. This performance is somewhat validating of the original signal, as it suggests that the stock is still trending upwards, although the move is not extremely strong. The fact that it was able to close above $1.10 is a positive sign, and we'll be watching to see if it can build on this momentum. In other news, it's worth noting that retail investors are the largest shareholders of Resoro Mining, owning 38% of the company, while private companies own 36%. This is an interesting dynamic, as it suggests that individual investors are driving the stock's price action to some extent, and this could potentially lead to some volatility in the future. This could be contributing to the stock's ability to maintain its upward trend, as retail investors continue to support the stock. As we look ahead to next week, we'll be watching to see if RML.V can continue to build on its momentum and break out above $1.15. We'll also be keeping an eye on the volume, to see if it can continue to surge and drive the stock higher. Now let's move on to our next stock. We're taking a look at stock number 8 of 10, which is Moon.V, and the signal was detected on May 26, 2026. This signal was a pretty significant one, so let's dive into the details. The MA Golden Cross Plus volume surge signal is a really strong indicator of potential upward momentum, and when we saw this signal on May 26, it meant that the stock's moving averages were crossing over in a bullish pattern, and volume was surging by 250.7%, which is a huge increase. At the time, the RSI was at 58.7, which isn't overly extended, so there was still room for the stock to run. This signal suggested that Moon.V could be poised for a breakout, and with the volume surge, it looked like investors were taking notice. This week, Moon.V gained a modest 0.2%, which isn't a huge move, but it did open at $9.40, reach a high of $9.62, and a low of $8.57, before closing at $9.42. This performance doesn't entirely validate the original signal, but it does show that the stock is still holding up relatively well. The lack of a big move this week could be due to a number of factors, but it's worth keeping an eye on to see if the stock can regain its momentum. In recent news, Blue Moon Metals has signed an agreement to combine its NSG unit with Alpha Future Funds VMS, which could potentially be a big deal for the company. This news could be a factor in the stock's relatively stable performance this week, as investors wait to see how this agreement plays out. It's possible that this news has given investors a reason to hold on to their shares, rather than selling, which could be supporting the stock's price. Looking ahead to next week, Viewers should watch for whether Moon.V can regain its upward momentum, and whether this agreement with Alpha Future Funds VMS will have a positive impact on the stock. We'll also be keeping an eye on the stock's volume and RSI to see if there are any changes that could signal a bigger move. Now let's move on to our next stock. We're taking a look at stock number 9 of 10, which is IFOS.V, and the signal was detected on June 18, 2026. This stock caught our attention with a very interesting combination of technical indicators that suggested a potential buy opportunity. The MA Golden Cross Plus volume surge signal indicated a bullish trend, with the short-term moving average crossing above the long-term moving average, and a significant increase in trading volume of 30.9%, which is a great sign of investor interest. At the time, the RSI was at 41.8, which is relatively neutral, but the volume surge and the Golden Cross suggested that there was some upward momentum building. This signal was particularly interesting because it suggested that the stock was poised for a potential breakout. This week, however, IFOS.V declined by 6.9%, which is not exactly what we were hoping for, given the bullish signal we saw last week. It opened at $2.60, reached a high of $2.60, and a low of $2.35, before closing at $2.42. Despite this decline, it's worth noting that the stock is still above its entry price of $2.58, so the signal is not entirely invalidated, but it's definitely something we need to keep an eye on. In terms of news, we saw a recent announcement that Itafos and Rio Tinto have amended their sulfuric acid contract, which could have some implications for the stock's performance going forward. This contract amendment could potentially impact the company's revenue and profitability, and it's something that investors should be aware of. The stock's weekly decline may be related to this news, as investors digest the potential implications of the contract amendment. As we look ahead to next week, we'll be watching to see if IFOS.V can bounce back from this decline, and whether the bullish trend suggested by the Golden Cross signal will reassert itself. We'll also be keeping an eye on any further news or developments related to the sulfuric acid contract amendment to see how it affects the stock's performance. Now let's move on to our next stock. We're wrapping up our weekly review with stock number 10, BTE.TO, where we detected a signal on July 7. The signal was a MACD bullish crossover combined with a volume surge, which is a pretty strong indicator of a potential upward trend. The MACD bullish crossover plus volume surge signal is a technical indicator that suggests the stock is gaining momentum and could be due for a price increase, and at the time, the RSI was at 42.0, which is relatively neutral, and the volume surge was a significant 57.9% increase. This signal meant that we could see a potential breakout, and the volume surge added confidence to this signal. The entry price at the time was $5.68, so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. This stock gained 3.8% this week. It opened at $5.54, reached a high of $5.93 and a low of $5.47, closing at $5.75. This performance seems to validate the original signal, as the stock is moving in the right direction. The weekly performance is a positive sign, and we'll continue to monitor the stock's movement. The stock's ability to close near its high for the week is also a bullish sign. The recent rally in Cenovus Energy stock, which climbed 3.5%, could be contributing to the overall positive sentiment in the energy sector, and this may have had a spillover effect on BTE.TO. This rally could be fueling interest in other energy stocks, including BTE.TO. The energy sector as a whole seems to be gaining momentum. Viewers should watch for continued momentum in the energy sector and whether BTE.TO can build on its recent gains. Next week, we'll be keeping an eye on whether the stock can break through its recent high and continue its upward trend. That wraps up our weekly review. Subscribe for daily TSX signals from NorthFlow Finance. Thanks for tuning in, subscribe for more, and remember, this is not financial advice, consult a professional before making decisions.